Welcome, everybody. I'm Bruce Matador. I'm the chair of the Africa Study Group. This is our first 2021 calendar year webinar as we go almost ready to go into a second year of virtual meetings, which allow us to start on time, which we almost, as I was just saying to our panelists, we almost never did when we had physical meetings. And hope that you will find it worthwhile. I will just say that we are recording. We will have a video of this, and it will be posted to our YouTube channel in due course, which means within the next week, I believe. And our next event is one on governance and security in Africa, and it will be next Friday the 5th, starting at 11 o'clock in the morning, because we have a panelist coming in from Paris. It's not a normal time for us, but these are not normal times. So today's session, I'm very happy to have back, because we had David and Shireen on a previous session. So Shireen Hassim and David Hornsby will talk about South Africa and assessing 3 years of the Ramaphosa presidency. Just to introduce them, I'm sure you are already aware. Shireen is the Canada 150 Research Chair in Gender and African Politics at the Institute of African Studies at Carleton, and she's associated with the Institute for Social and Economic Research at the University of the Witwatersrand. David is the professor of, I know I got this wrong last time, the associate president, I got it right?
Vice President.
Vice President, sorry, of Internet and Professor of International Affairs at the Norman Paterson School, also at Carleton. He previously had appointments at University College London School of International Affairs, and before joining NIPSIA, he had appointments at University College. I got something wrong there, and the University of Witwatersrand. Anyway, I'm looking at an old piece of document. So with that, we will have a presentation, and then we will open it up for questions and answers. I would say that obviously the language is in English. If somebody has a question in French, I can endeavor to translate to make sure that we get the proper question asked. So with that, I will turn it over to who's starting? Shireen, ladies first. Very sexist. But,
No, we don't say that anymore, Bruce. No. Thank you very much. Thank you for this invitation. It's lovely to be doing this again, and to be doing it in this context where we all feel so isolated. And, to some extent, I think what David and I are going to do is share with you our many conversations that have been taking place over the course of this past year. I want to just also say this is a conversation usually that also involves Trinesh Padiachi. And so not that I want her to be responsible for anything we say. David and I thought that it seemed really apposite to think about the Ramaphosa presidency against the backdrop of COVID, because like all the presidents that kind of came into power soon and were landed with this pandemic on at their desks immediately, the pandemic has exposed strengths and weaknesses in a particularly heightened way. So rather than talking very generally about Ramaphosa's presidency, we will try and tie it to the ways in which he and his government have responded to COVID. I'll just say that most of you know that Cyril Ramaphosa, formerly the Secretary General of the National Union of Mine Workers, the central figure in the transitional negotiations during the CODESA period, the person who has been credited together with Rolf Meyer for doing the second track in the negotiations process, was initially seen to be very much a front runner for the presidency after Mandela's death, but was edged out, nevertheless remained a central figure in the ANC. And I won't go through the, the detail of those factional fights, but in 2018 was the central figure in the dislodging of President Zuma as the ANC president, and then took over as president of the country in April 2019, after he delivered a majority to the ANC in conditions that were really very unfavorable for the party. This was a moment that was ripe for opposition parties to make significant inroads, but I think most commentators would agree that the fact that Ramaphosa was the president of the ANC changed the conversation considerably and restored some degree of hope, particularly among the middle class, for a different kind of government to emerge. It was a slight victory over, and it was a reduced majority for the ANC when you look at all the elections up to that moment. But it was nevertheless a significant one because it promised an end to the era of rapacious corruption that characterized the Zuma years. Just to give you a sense of what Ramaphosa inherited, an economy that was depleted, with the cost conservatively estimated at 34 billion US dollars, or a tenth of South Africa's GDP. The estimated cost of the corruption that was associated with Zuma. And that's the conservative estimate. There are many more figures. Some go as high as 3 times that 34 billion US dollars. So, what Ramaphosa comes into is a moment in which he is promising clean government and an end to the period of state capture. David will say more about that, in which a phenomenon in which jobs and tenders were being given to a small circle of people close to the ANC. So there was some optimism in the air by May 2019, but by the end of 2019, just before the pandemic, already that optimism seemed to have evaporated, because the direct effects of state capture had begun to hit every household in the country. Nobody was spared, no matter your class status, no matter your geographic privilege, no matter your race or gender, from the collapse. The central agency in this moment was the collapse of the state-owned energy supplier Eskom. Eskom's collapse went along with a recession, the second official recession in 10 years, the third official recession since 1994, the cumulative effect of years of mismanagement of the economy. And I'm not going to go through all those figures, but maybe, David, we should look at that next slide. Am I right? Is the next slide the one that just shows you? Oh, sorry, this is the COVID slide. I'm not the.
Do you want that slide?
That slide. So this period, in this period, you see how the corruption led to this rapid rise in South African levels of debt in South Africa. By the way, large part of this debt is also held inside the country, which changes things. But certainly at the global, in terms of the government's capacity to borrow globally, this debt is a significant inheritance for Ramaphosa. But even before the pandemic, it's important to say that we had the highest levels of unemployment, close to 40% in real unemployment estimates. tracking the inherited patterns of racial and gender inequalities, women, of course, bearing the highest brunt of this, and a rise in inequalities because CEOs on the stock exchange listed companies, of course, continue to do very, very well despite the economic collapse. These debt levels and this sort of growing crisis in the country's balance of payments and the country's reserves set the scene for what any country would have had to deal with, a disaster of the pandemic. But at least at the level of government, its resources to deal with COVID were already depleted before the pandemic hit. And when it did hit, the pandemic, do you want to say something about the pandemic, David? I've forgotten. Is it your...
No problem. I mean, Shereen, you're totally on the right track. I mean, what we see here, right, is in 2016-17 that already the percentage of debt to GDP ratio was at 50%. Now, under normal conditions, that's considered to be rather high, and that's been something that has been rising as a result, direct result of sort of the Zuma years and the challenges of corruption, but then as well the collapse of Eskom, as Shereen was talking about. But what we found under the context of the pandemic is that in order for the South African state to continue to operate in the way that it needs to and provide the services it needs to function, the sort of dramatic increase in borrowing that has taken place. And that, you see by the red line here, the sort of the shift that took place in the medium-term budget process in 2020, which was, I believe, October, November time. This is a remarkable demarcation from what was expected in budget 2017, which is done with the blue line. And then, of course, the normal budget that was done just as the pandemic was really taking root in February 2020. What we see here, though, is a dramatic increase. 81% at the moment of GDP, the level of debt to GDP. That's an incredible number. We're seeing that rise over the next 5 to 6 years up to a high of 95%. I mean, what this does is it significantly hampers the capacity of the state to spend on the social programs that are necessary to shore up the society. To put it into perspective, right, this level of debt and the cost to service this debt is the equivalent of the entire health budget for South Africa and is more than double the higher education budget. So just to give you a number, that's about 233 million rand just to service. So all of a sudden, there is 233 million rand, billion rand out of the economy in South Africa. And that has a really significant capacity on, it really inhibits the ability of Ramaphosa, for example, to chart a way forward. Shereen, do you want me to move to the next slide, or do you have something more to say?
While you move to the next slide, I'll just say that the significant thing about that debt is that it is internally induced, right? So it's not, we can't lay this at the feet of the fate of other middle income countries, because at the time that South Africa's economy is slowly but inexorably beginning to tank, other developing countries between this period 2009-2019, other developing countries are growing at an average of 4.8% per annum. South Africa is growing at 1.4% per annum. So this decline has everything to do with the internal collapse in the ANC and in the state itself. Thanks, David.
Absolutely. And I think, if we now look at this current slide, what we're looking at here are income tax payers in South Africa. And, I think it's worth noting this is a comparator between 2017 and 2020. And it was remarkable back in 2017, the number of income taxpayers in South Africa. It was a small number in terms of the overall population. And this is, it's declined even more. So the middle class in South Africa has been squeezed by the pandemic and the economic fallout of the pandemic. And we've seen more people slip back into poverty into sort of more precarious conditions, what we call in this graph here, the skilled strugglers, than ever before. We've seen a decline, middle-class population decline from 6.1 million individuals to 2.7 million in these last 3 years. And this, speaks to the corruption piece, but it also speaks to the impact of the pandemic. And we all know the capacity of the state to spend and to prepare and get its way out of such a difficult economic circumstance is going to be incredibly encumbered by this dramatic decrease in the number of income taxpayers. And just as a comparator, I mean, I think Canada is sitting at something like 75% of its population paying income tax. South Africa, it's well under 12%, and that's really quite significant.
Yeah, so what you have here is a pattern where the poorest of the poor are being supported through a very extensive system of grants, and those grants are really reducing poverty at the lowest level. They're also, of course, creating a vote bank for the ruling party, which it was very good at mobilizing in electoral periods. But it's a kind of it's a ticking time bomb, because it's relatively unsustainable with the tax base, as David is pointing out. But it's also, it means that there's just no space in this budget to maintain the public sphere as we know it. So health, education, housing, the delivery of basic services such as sanitation to all areas. There's no give in this budget to develop that, and increasingly, but between 2015 and 2020, different sectors of society are beginning to fight over the scarce resources. And the most heightened fight was university students demanding free higher education, right? A noble demand, obviously, something that we would all, I think, in the abstract, definitely support. But in a context where you have no replenishment of the fiscus, that means pitting one set of claims against another in particularly brutal ways. And one of the trade-offs we know now was in health spending. So these force trade-offs that are really iniquitous on a society. Yeah. So do we want to go on to the COVID numbers? Because then, here we have an economic time bomb ticking away anyway, and then COVID presents us with a health time bomb, which becomes a social time bomb. So David, I'll let you speak to this slide.
Right. So I mean, what we have here are the contrast between the sort of the COVID infections and the COVID deaths. I think the infection rate, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, updated from yesterday, you can see that it's surpassed the 1 million person mark in terms of infections. It's coming up on 1.5 million, which is pretty extraordinary when you think about the size of the South African state in relation to others. So clearly the infection has spread quite significantly. We've heard lots in the media about the South African variant of the COVID-19 virus. It speaks on one level to a deep capacity, a deep scientific capacity to be able to look at virus evolution and to be able to communicate about it in really informed ways, and to then also communicate about it internationally. So on one level, South Africa has been a real leader in terms of discussing the virus and trying to understand how it mutates and changes. The downside is what we've seen is that South Africa has also become a space where a mutated virus is ravaging the country. And you can see that taking place just even with the cases as of yesterday. What we've also seen is a spike in terms of the number of deaths, I think, which Shireen, you might want to speak a little bit to as a result of the sort of declining health capacity of the state. But we do see that that coming down. But I mean, what this speaks to ultimately, right, the infection rate and the death rate is really, I think, two fundamental things. One is the inability or the ineffectiveness of the South African measures, government measures, to try and enforce social distancing and other sort of virus mitigating measures. And then as well, the inability of the state to actually deal with those who are infected and who are struggling to cope with this, namely through the hospital system. Shireen, do you want to say more on that?
Yeah, so you'll probably all remember that initially South Africa was lauded for the way in which it responded, particularly in the context of the US and the UK. The two countries to which South Africa often looks for comparisons, or commentators inside South Africa use as comparators. So, in the context of the dithering and the bumbling that was happening and the sort of anti-science approach in those countries, initially, it seemed like the president came out of the blocks with a very clear line: science matters, we will listen to the scientists, set up a medical advisory committee with the best minds in the country on that committee. And bear in mind, we have been through the AIDS crisis in South Africa, so we have very highly developed capacities for dealing with a pandemic like this. In many important ways, the country has a lot of amazing systems in place. We'll talk about why they didn't work. But the Medical Advisory Council initially was very united, and the first sort of response was very similar to the Canadian response, in fact, which was to have quite a strict lockdown. But the lockdown measures, unfortunately, were kind of too blunt a mechanism. So the assumption was that everybody would stay in place, but it was highly insensitive to the local context, right? So lockdown distancing was obviously the right way to deal with the pandemic, but the way in which this was messaged by the government was poor. It went for a kind of, I think it just did not communicate effectively with citizens. So in the first wave, it announced the lockdown, and everybody in the country, just about, moved from urban to rural areas. So it wasn't a shelter-in-place policy. People treated it as if they were going to go home for the holidays, which meant huge amounts of mobility. That was the first problem. The second problem is that, social distancing in a context where many people are living in a very close proximity to their neighbors, and where there's huge overcrowding in the housing, and where the weather is such that people are used to spending more time outdoors than indoors. It just was a very blunt instrument. And the government did not seem to respond to suggestions by people such as Niva Makgetla, who's one of the leading economists in the country, who very quickly said the kind of lockdown we should be doing is neighborhood-based lockdown. In other words, you don't isolate people inside their tiny little shacks, but you create little zones of enclosure where people can move about within those. That didn't happen. Lockdown, as we know from the Canadian example, I don't think Canada, here we did it as well either, is meant to be the period where you build up your test and trace capabilities and you prepare hospitals for the pandemic. Did not work very well in doing that because the resources just weren't there. David, you'll talk about PPE in a minute. And the corruption around that. But the response sort of started to fall apart, and the government's incapabilities, its infrastructural incapacities really began to show, because the instrument it had at its that was best developed was a kind of securitized response. So it had police reinforcing very harsh lockdown arrangements on poor people who weren't clear why, you could go to a supermarket and buy cooked chicken, but you couldn't buy the cooked chicken from your neighbor or the auntie who was selling it on the street side, right? So these really blunt and securitized measures started to pit citizens against the state. So the Ramaphosa sort of approach, which was to attempt to build national unity around this pandemic and what seemed to be promising in the beginning, promising enough that when the government set up the Solidarity Fund, a large number of local large capitalists put money into it, right? It was a good public-private initiative to set up a solidarity fund. But this trust between government and citizens began to erode, and increasingly then trust also between government and the business sector also, I think, began to erode as a result of the corruption that David might want to say a word or two about.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I'd like to sort of frame this as in the context of Ramaphosa, the leader. I mean, I think what we've been talking through here are a number of the structural conditions that Ramaphosa has faced. And I mean, if for those of you who were at Shireen and I's initial presentation, 3 years ago around the election, we were circumspect, or at least Shireen was far more circumspect than I was. I had a hopeful mindset around what Ramaphosa was going to achieve. And, from a leadership perspective, Ramaphosa still is a gift to South Africa. He is viewed as non-corrupt. He is viewed as somebody who is above reproach and who is committed to trying to put in place the conditions for South Africa to be once again a successful state, be it economically, socially, politically. But what we're finding is, after 3 years, is that he's coming up against the real limitations and power of the presidency in the capacity of the state to achieve or to actually roll out the changes that he needs. Right? He has been trying to grow investment. He has been trying to improve business, the business conditions so that jobs are created. But his whole personal handling of the pandemic, namely, we see him here, this picture of him with the mask on. He's been sort of gently teased as the father in chief because he's been holding all these state of the nation addresses or national addresses to sort of chide people or to into better behavior or to announce particular restrictions and trying to encourage sort of a sense of community around the response that's been required. But his capacity and his ability to achieve these grand objectives and these hopeful aspirations are really limited by the party in which he heads and the deep rot and corruption that has been sort of thrust upon the country after 9 years of Jacob Zuma.
I would say, David, here, this is perhaps the one issue in which you and I disagree. Mm-hmm. Because I continue to think that he was never that reliable to begin with. We do have to remember that Ramaphosa was deputy president under Zuma for a time, that he was in the party all through these years of corruption, that he never spoke out in that time until right at the end, and that the party, had this view that you fight your battles inside the party, right? And that was breaking, I think, a very significant element of any kind of democratic pact between sovereign and citizens, right? That this strange kind of, it's not strange, this is familiar to many people, kind of a hangover of a democratic centralism, as it was known, where everyone rallies together behind the unified message of the party. But when the party is deeply corrupt, as the ANC now is, then all that serves to do is to prop up the corruption and treat citizens as if they are not trustworthy themselves or have no right to this information. So when Ramaphosa came into the presidency, he was very much liked, particularly by business, because he had played that second track role, working with business in the negotiations for democracy. But he'd become very much rooted in that world of business. His hands, I think it's, many people would say his hands are not as clean as we might think. Whatever, I don't want to go into the details of the Marikana event, but, there he was seen to be against the unions and willing to support the use of excessive force by police against the union. So I think he came in with a lot of fanfare from business and from the middle class, because he seemed to be a modern, sophisticated, outwardly focused and efficient president compared to President Zuma. But I'm not sure he really has all that. And I'll just say one thing about these so-called family meetings. And David's right, at the beginning, people kind of liked it. People felt this was an attempt to communicate. This was a good thing, right? But the family meetings, more and more citizens are saying, we're not members of a family, actually. We don't have the same interests. We don't trust the government. We don't believe you're doing the right thing. And now we're being called to these so-called family meetings, which really, where we all have to be quiet and listen to the great patriarch tell us what to do. So it's kind of falling apart because, if there's no substance behind that, people see through it. So the stimulus package, perhaps we should talk about that and the sort of attempt to deal with the emergency of the pandemic, as well as the emergency of the economy together, and this allocation of 500 billion rands to a so-called stimulus package, which, when several economists have begun to untangle it and are beginning to argue that, in fact, I'm drawing here on the work of Duma Krubule in particular, who has analyzed the stimulus package and says that only 81 billion of that supposed 500 billion rands can be considered to be part of a stimulus. Most of it is just reallocating existing expenditure. There's still a tendency to bail out failing state-owned enterprises like South African Airways, which has cost a huge amount of money, which could have gone to dealing with what's needed in the health system for the virus and in the economy, by the way, for dealing with the virus. So this package, emergency package, for example, has no relief measures for ordinary people who've lost their income. I mean, we know from CERB in Canada, the lockdown could not have continued without the CERB payments to people, right? So it basically locks people out of the economy, does not give them any financial means to survive, and then is punitive towards people when they go out to work. It's really, I would say he has not been a strong leader through the pandemic, even though he started with high hopes. The Medical Advisory Council is falling apart and fighting publicly with each other. So in the second round of appointments, the most critical people on the MAC didn't make it into the second round. They've been cut out. So we have the same old patterns being reinvented. The critical voices in civil society being told that they are unpatriotic, that they're being difficult, that they don't understand. So I think that we've come to this point in the pandemic where I think people are being left to fend for themselves. The death rate is increasing to a rate that, I mean, I think it's a country that is deeply traumatized at this moment by the number of deaths. Everybody knows somebody who has died. And there seems to be little optimism about what government will do.
So I mean, I think
David and Shireen, it's Bruce. Just to, I know you were keen to have Q&A, so we're at about getting about between 35 and 40 minutes now. So do you want to sort of pull things together, and then I'd invite at the same time people to put in questions so that we have something to start chewing on at that point.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Bruce. And just simply to think, to wrap it up, what Shireen and I are both saying, and I think we both agree that, Ramaphosa, whilst he, looked good and seemed hopeful, has really been constrained by a number of significant factors in terms of an ability to lead. And whilst, I accept Shireen's critique that Ramaphosa has been part of the machination for a long time, I would not go so far as to suggest that he is like a Mike Pence to a Donald Trump, complicit. What I would say, though, is that he is held hostage to a party machination and a party system that is so deeply now entrenched and weaved into the state that it makes it very difficult to chart his own policy approach, which I think, if he had his way, would actually be far more positive and far less corrupt than what we're seeing now. So if that's fair to end on that, Shireen, I'm happy to unshare my screen, and we can now open it up for Q&A.
I intercepted one earlier one, which I was going to ask, was asking basically based on your chart of the debt ratio. I was going to say that on that point, of course, most developed countries' debt ratios look a bit like that too. And what our government would say is, at current interest rates, it's bearable, and people don't expect interest rates to go up that quickly. Some people are skeptical about that, but but on the other hand, it may be true for Canada. It's likely, and I guess this is the question for you: is the interest rate outlook in South Africa, I would expect, would be not as favorable as in Canada or the US in that context. So that's the first question, and we're starting to get some other ones.
Sure. Shireen, if you're happy, I can just jump on that first, and you can jump in after. But the interest rate, the borrowing costs within South Africa are far more significant. What's important to note here too, right, is that South Africa is borrowing against its own banks. So this is domestically denominated and held debt.
But that's actually usually a good thing in this context, as Shireen implied, right? I mean, it's you're less likely to be held hostage, at least in the short run, and you're paying it to. You don't have to send the money out of the country in the first round.
Yes, very true. But the interest rates are much higher. So we're looking at interest rates at the moment of about 9.3%. Now, the South African Central Bank SARB has decreased interest rates as of late, but have now started to signal that they're not going to be lowering them any further. Still at a 9.3 or 9 point some odd.
A long way from a 0 or 1.
Much higher than what we're currently facing here in Canada, that's for certain.
Okay, so the first question I have is how will you assess South Africa's contribution to COVID diplomacy at the Davos meeting, where on Tuesday he urged wealthy countries not to hoard surplus COVID-19 vaccine supplies? This is, of course, a very current discussion with the EU's efforts. And how will you assess the South African government ability to secure such vaccines in the post-COVID period?
I'll have a go at that. I mean, I think this is a really interesting question, because where history does matter. So our experience, the country's experience with the AIDS drugs, you might remember, South Africa was at the forefront eventually, after being pushed by civil society, mainly the Treatment Action Campaign, to fight against the pharmaceutical industry. And the government joined a couple of other governments in pushing back against certain kinds of trade agreements and pricing of pharmaceutical companies. So there's a history in South Africa of favoring the idea, at least officially, the idea that it should be health before profits. And South Africa has been a very strong supporter in the Global South bloc for agreements that are reached internationally through World Health Organization and so on. So quite rightly, I think South Africa went into the discussion about the vaccine through the COVAX mechanism. And that the intention there of the COVAX mechanism is that you will manage both distribution and prices. So I think on that front, Ramaphosa's government has done the right thing. But you know, there is a global apartheid in vaccine distribution and delivery. And countries like India retained and grew its manufacturing capacity for drugs. South Africa's pharmaceutical manufacturing industry ran down in the first decade after 94. And so we're seeing the effects of that. There's no internal, there's only one, I think, manufacturing facility in South Africa, and most of those, I think it's a Pfizer facility. Most of the vaccines manufactured there have already been promised elsewhere. So that feels rather harsh, that you can make the vaccines but not keep them. South African researchers also went into the COVAX process on the testing of the vaccines. And the assumption was that there would be a quid pro quo, that we would have some preferential access to getting the vaccines. None of that has panned out. Hopefully it will change. Hopefully the agreements, particularly with the Indian partnership, will bear some fruit for the South African approach. The opposition Democratic Alliance wants much more private sector involvement. I personally think that is not the route to go. And you know, maybe David will talk about Canada. David and I have been bemoaning the way Canada has treated this issue. You know, I'll let David, you're a true blue Canadian, you can criticize your government.
No, I mean, I think, you know, the way that the Canadian government has been hoarding the supply of vaccines, or at least sort of buying up supply in sort of 5 times the necessary amount, is something that we really need to challenge and ask ourselves about what motivates that. I mean, I maintain a deep concern that it's a very narrow definition of self-interest that underpins such an action, and then to turn around and so you know, seemingly generous, suggest that they'll donate these vaccines to countries that are within the COVAX pool, I think is quite striking. Why can't we simply share the vaccine supply on the levels that's needed? Why can't we, as a global community, come together and think about who needs to be vaccinated and how we roll that out? You know, we can be talking about first responders. We can be talking about particular age groups across the globe. We don't have to just do this as a narrow country by country type of endeavor. And I think
I'm not in the business of defending the Canadian government, but I think, to be slightly fair, they didn't know, and the 5 times is there's lots of those vaccines have not yet been approved. So they were, and as we can see, they're still trying to get their 1 times their population, which we don't have yet. But so anyway, I just wanted there's a couple of people put up their hand. I don't even know actually how to give people the right to speak at that point. Could I ask you to put in questions? We have several questions lined up. And so if you have something you want to ask, with all due respect, my apologies. So we have questions from Gaston Barbin, which are double. One of them is a sort of a straight, probably a short answer anyway. And then the second one is a little bit more specific on policies. So if not Ramaphosa, who else? Well, who are the South African politicians who could replace him and take the country where it needs to go? And then the other question is, what hope do you put in the Zondo Commission in giving people some measure of optimism and helping South Africa see its way out of its political economic situation.
You want me to go, David? You're looking. You look like you don't want to touch this with a barge pole. I mean, that's the problem in South Africa, isn't it? If not Ramaphosa, who? If not the ANC, actually, who? So we have this completely inadequate party system, I think. The Democratic Alliance should hang its head in shame, in my view, because it really has not offered an effective opposition in the last couple of years. I think it did a good job as a parliamentary opposition in pushing for certain things to be made public, and did attempt to hold Zuma accountable in Parliament. But actually, it is not a party that has developed any level of capability for reaching out to Black voters. It has remained very narrowly focused and does not seem to be particularly interested. In its last party congress, it reiterated its sort of unwillingness to deal with, to use any kinds of affirmative action mechanisms, for example, for dealing with inequalities in South Africa. So it alienates, and then it also has a tone issue. It has a very patronizing way of talking to voters, and that just doesn't go down well. So we don't have an effective opposition party in the middle. The opposition party on the left, the Economic Freedom Fighters, I'll stick my neck out here and say I think is profoundly undemocratic, and also incapable of offering anything other than opposition. So that is South Africa's big problem, is inability to develop a level of leadership inside the ANC that would be able to take us forward. And from that point of view, yes, Ramaphosa's the best bet. There is no one else. And so I think that's why he had so much goodwill coming into office, because everyone was willing him to succeed in some way for different kinds of reasons. There was a second part to that question.
Well, the second one was the second question, which was about the Zondo Commission and what its capacity for giving people some measure of optimism and helping South Africa get out of its current situation.
I think it's just been the source of national despair, because the Zondo Commission, which has gone on now for a very long time, this has been a very long commission with very few prosecutions yet emerging out of it. There's a new public prosecutor in place who seems more willing to take up the issues, and without prosecution, it's one tale after another of corruption and mismanagement, and all it has served to do is to expose how deeply rooted and how widespread, how deep and how wide across the state this corruption went. So I don't think it is I think it's necessary. I mean, transparency is needed, but transparency without some degree of justice, I think, is not going to satisfy people. And of course, the problem with the Zondo Commission is that it exposes and can maybe go after South African figures. But let's not forget that there are large companies that have been involved in this state capture process, not large international companies like KPMG, like Bell Pottinger, so these institutions, these corporations all just escape any kind of accountability.
I mean, if I could just jump in on this one too, because I noticed that Gaston has asked an additional question about the big tent and the tripartite.
There's lots of them, so keep it short. We got lots of.
Yeah, I mean, literally. I mean, I think with the Zondo Commission, I agree about the despair comment. I think there's still a degree of hope here that this will help weed out some of the rot within the ANC party. It should be viewed in the frame of sort of factions fighting each other in the Zondo Commission. in the hope that somebody will emerge, and we hope it's the sort of the faction that sort of has the best interest of the country at heart. Whether or not, it's still yet to be seen whether or not that's going to be successful. And on that score, Gaston, if the Zondo Commission doesn't work, if it collapses for whatever reason, do I think that there's a strong potential for the tripartite alliance to collapse? Yeah, I do.
Okay, Tariq Abusali has a question on which should be a roughly yes or no. How did the new virus of COVID-19 enter South Africa, and why is there a huge surge in cases in the last few days? I guess that's the explanation, but I mean, I'm not quite sure. What's the situation on the new virus? Is it from South Africa or from the UK?
Yeah, well, the flu virus mutates. That's happening everywhere around the world. The South African variant is not the only one. The reason we know about the South African variant and we knew about it so quickly is because we have very good scientists, very skilled and adept at tracking infectious diseases in South Africa. So the local capacity is very good. Right. But there are new variants emerging all over the world, everywhere.
Yeah. On the issue of income distribution, Louise, we may talking about your slide, which showed the middle class from 2017, like the taxpayers was now struggling. The smaller components seem to be made of former 5% and 1% people. Could this result in civil unrest in coming months, since it's unlikely that the situation is going to improve very quickly?
There's permanent civil unrest. Whether it can be aggregated into something meaningful is the question, Louise. I think you're right that the middle class, that small middle class, really is struggling, and all of the underinvestment in the public goods of health and education and electricity supply and so on are felt very keenly by the employed middle class, because they pay high taxes and then they pay this additional level of taxes, and so they're getting very little back. And jobs are scarcer and scarcer, and inflation is higher and higher. So they have been under strain for a considerable amount of time. And that middle class was behind Ramaphosa, I think, in terms of the goodwill. So yes, I think they are under strain. I think that, the lack of, for those of you who have friends in South Africa, you'll know on a day-to-day basis, even if you live in a very well-resourced middle-class neighborhood, you don't know whether you're going to have water and electricity for the next few days. So those are, but without a party alternative, I don't know who people will vote for. And without a strong, coherent force outside of the party system to aggregate all these disaffected groups of people, I'm not sure where it will go.
Okay, well, I have a couple of questions here that, like, I'm going to put them together because they're from different people. They feed into the outlook for you political scientists. So Alison Frodella, would you say that Ramaphosa's presidency has garnered more support for the ANC, I presume net since he took over, maintained the status quo, or has highlighted serious misgivings with a hegemonic party such as the ANC? And then Gaston Barbin has what is the outlook for a potential fragmentation of the big tent ANC into several components, Workers' Party, like led by Kosatsu, and perhaps a center-left party bringing together the liberal wing of the ANC with a new Democratic Alliance? And there was a question, I thought there was a question about the position of the Democratic Alliance on something, but it disappeared. So, I don't know whether the person retracted it, but it was on land reform. What was the DA's position on land reform?
I typed an answer to it, Bruce, just to facilitate.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, I thought they would show up.
Okay, yeah, I'll do that. I was working my way down.
I haven't seen that.
Which one are we wanting to start with? I mean, the DAs.
Alison Fridella and Gaston Barbon, they're both about sort of the outlook for, if you like, is the ANC's level of support that went up under the first election that you talked about last time, is it's going to stay, like that increase from Ramaphosa is going to stay, or as Gaston asks, is there going to be fragmentation of a big tent ANC into two or more smaller and more less big tent and more ideologically in the context of spatially distanced, you have ideologically distanced parties or something. It doesn't
I think in part I responded to that Gaston piece about the big tent and the potential for a tripartite alliance collapse, connected to the Zondo Commission and how that sort of pans out. Just to highlight, I mean, Ramaphosa, I think his fortunes, they were less than what they had been before insofar as ANC popular vote. So he has been still overseeing a party in decline. I think part of our message last time was that it was going to be a lot worse had it not been for Ramaphosa. So the big question going forward in the next round of elections will be, will his brand as sort of the clean corruption fighter type of president, will that still stick? Or is the despair that I think Shireen quite rightly taps into going to see an even further decline? And I wonder on that score whether or not it'll be a decline in ANC popular vote, or just people staying away from voting altogether, because the options just aren't there.
I think that most voters are seeing very little of value at the moment in the formal political system. So yeah, I mean, I agree with David. It would be a good thing for the big tent to collapse and shake itself up, but it's not clear who would lead a center-left or left party at the moment.
It's back to your point about who's not clear who would replace Ramaphosa. In a sense. Yeah. Okay. I was looking in the wrong list. I was in the answered list as opposed to, and I was trying to find out which ones were. So you have in a sense answered Gaston's question about the fragmentation, even though it's so. Anyway, and then from Marcia or John Sackbucks, holding constant the reality of deep corruption and reduced state capacity. Conventional borrowing won't solve the financial crisis. Do you see any possibility for unconventional responses using modern monetary theory, recognizing the threat of inflation?
There's a lot of pressure I would say, on the government now to think about ways of spending itself out of this crisis. But it can't seem to get right spending on what. So it did not use the emergency funding for expanding the number of healthcare workers, for example. That would be one useful form of spending, right? That would be worth increasing deficits. That would be worth, the pandemic allows you to make a claim for that, for building up those spending in the public sector in that way. But at the moment, what they're just floundering, I would say. They're using a lot of state funds and a lot of borrowed money to bail out things like I was saying earlier, South African Airways, because they have some very powerful lobbying interests pushing them to do that. So some of that has gone to court, but we'll see where that. At the moment, I think they are. There's a lot of conversation about a different model and using modern monetary theory as the way forward, but it's not clear that the ANC is listening to them. And the left economists that I'm following are feeling very frustrated with the government for not considering that. I mean, ultimately, investing in housing, healthcare, education, sanitation, these are going to lift us both out of the poverty problem as well as out of the pandemic. Like those are, it should align at this moment, but it's not succeeding politically. And I'm afraid the Democratic Alliance is not an ally for that kind of option.
There's also another dimension to this too, right? Which is the private sector in South Africa is sitting on a mountain of cash.
Yeah.
They are not reinvesting their money, their profits into the South African economy. And it's in large part due to the deep concern around the corruption piece and whether or not their efforts are going to be recognized and going to achieve the ends as opposed to just going into somebody's pocket. So there's also an element there too, John, about, creating perhaps what is required as a new social compact that includes as well the private sector and recognizing that they do have some financial means in this moment to assist.
Okay, then we have from Andre Bourassa, is the vacuum in opposition politics in South Africa, do opposition parties' failures to rise beyond being predominantly opposition for opposition's sake, rather than carving an identity and substance not defined by all that is wrong with the ANC?
Yes.
Yeah, I sort of thought you might say that.
That's a short answer. You're right. It's exactly.
Well, I must say, just to draw my own, when you commented about people not perhaps voting, it did remind me of the situation in Tunisia, which I know better than South Africa, and where, in fact, the disaffection with the political parties is, there was no political party that inherited the results of the Tunisian Spring, and the parties that did sort of come about are not doing very well, shall we say. And then, is it credible to push a narrative of Ramaphosa being a corruption buster when the top six of the NAC remain identical to what it was when Zuma was at the helm?
Say that again. Where's that?
Is it credible if a man or a politician is judged by the company he keeps? Is it really credible to push a narrative of Ramaphosa being a corruption buster when the top six of the NAC, of the ANC, I assume, remain identical to the top six when Zuma was at the helm?
Yeah.
I think you sort of implicitly said that already. Your answer to that is no. And then this is a separate one, and it actually, to my mind, it links a little bit to the answer you asked about South Africa's position on human rights at the Security Council, but this is actually in South Africa. The judge of the effects of violence against other Africans in South Africa. That aspect of what's happening has been happening in South Africa.
Yeah, one of the growing features of South African politics has, in the last 12, 15 years, has been the way in which the dissatisfactions and the sort of unhappiness with the state of the economy and the state of life, the quality of life, has been to turn on what are seen as your proximate causes, right? The rise of xenophobia, which has been happening over a long period of time and has now entered official discourse in ways that have been troubling for a very long time. And there's no party free of it. This morning, the ANC announced its replacement in Parliament for Jackson Ntambu, who passed away from COVID a few days ago, and it is a Chinese South African. And the reaction all day across the board on Twitter, shockingly, the reaction has been, why should we have a Chinese person lead us? We should only have Black people in government. So, xenophobia is like top to bottom in the society, has grown. It is the shock absorber. It's the explanation everybody inside political parties readily turns to for why there are no resources. So virtually every one of those claims for the ways in which immigrants are a burden on South Africa has been proved by research to be false, but it nevertheless plays politically, as we know, not just in South Africa, and it plays out in violent ways, I would say, against migrants.
No. I think,
And no party has an interest in courting them either, because they're not voting, right?
do they, well, I mean, initially they aren't. I mean, in Canada, they become voters and parties do have an interest in courting them. Is that because the naturalization process or just that the numbers are still too small?
No, the numbers are large, but they're not naturalized. Most don't become citizens.
Yeah. So there's not enough interest. Well, I mean, so there's not enough incentive for them to become citizens, then presumably.
There's no real incentive. I mean, if they get jobs, they pay taxes. If they buy anything, and the poor pay a huge amount of taxes through value-added taxes and so on, right? So they're economically active and contributing economically, but politically are not formally inside the system.
It's a convoluted process for foreigners to become citizens in South Africa. It's deeply challenging and fraught, and so there's definitely the incentive to become a citizen because of the access to things that you get, but it's so challenging and so difficult. I mean, I'm very happy to reflect on my own process, which the number of times my application got lost was really quite striking, and yet I sort of was sitting in a very privileged circumstance, so I can't imagine what it must have been like for somebody from Zimbabwe or from Zambia or
So there's a question of the process of citizenship is difficult. I'm aware of several academics from other African countries that are discriminated against despite their competition. And then a question which is slightly different, but one I think South Africa voted not to consider the atrocities in Ethiopia when the Europeans and others are trying to help. Your view on that? It's maybe more specific than the previous question. So this.
South Africa will go with the AU, basically. Yeah. Whatever the AU position is, South Africa is going to go with that position.
Yeah, there was a slightly similar question that David had. That was the way David had answered it. So I think we've actually currently answered all the questions, unless somebody's about to type some more. I'm just, one of these things is I hate to have to keep going down the list to make sure I haven't missed any, but I think, and David went ahead of me, that didn't help.
Sorry, Bruce.
But
I was trying to be efficient.
I think we have currently had all the questions. Oh no, here's a new one that Andre Boras has stuck in another one. The Mbeki administration was notorious for utilizing organs of state to settle political scores and deal with party factionalism. Is it fair to ask if Ramaphosa is doing the same with the numerous commissions of inquiry established since he assumed office? Given that other than all the corruption unveiled through this process, there has been no criminal repercussions for those implicated, and the only person to lose his job is Tom Moyana at SARS. I don't know if you say SARS, given it.
We do.
It could be confused with other things, but a disease still, but still. I mean,
if I could just jump in and Shreen, please counter me. I mean, I think there is a degree here, right, where Ramaphosa came in on the promise that he was going to try and clean things up, and so was really clear to people from the start that they were going to be subject. If they had engaged in corrupt behavior, they were going to be subject to the machinations of the law. I think what he hasn't done is gone on the witch hunts that he could have. So, he's on one level, he's tried to be smart and strategic to maintain his own position of power by allowing the sort of key institutions of the Constitution to play out, right? And then to set up these commissions to hold people to account in sort of quasi-legal or legal ways. Is it like Mbeki? No, because I think it's far more he's trying not to rock the boat and at the same time is trying to rock the boat.
So you're saying that, if I understand correctly, that then like there's not a lot of new corruption that he's managed to limit?
Oh, there is.
There still is.
There's huge amounts of corruption around the procurement of PPE, protective equipment.
So there is still lots of
around, all related to the COVID-19 pandemic. There's huge amounts of corruption inside the system. I think that in the beginning, Ramaphosa was sort of, as David says, happy to outsource stuff so that it's not faction fighting within the ANC. It's pushed out to these constitutionally agreed processes. But I don't think, even for people like David and I who are very immersed in local debates and politics, I don't think we quite foresaw the extent of what would get revealed at the Zondo Commission. So he may have thought, Ramaphosa may have thought he was outsourcing it. But what's happened with the Zondo Commission is that it's raised the stakes of the faction fighting inside the ANC. Because now, people are absolutely terrified of what might be the consequences, because there are seriously criminal revelations being made. And so they're worried about the consequences, which means that they're much more invested now in fighting for control of the party as the way in which to stop this happening. So I think there's an increasing desperation. And that has not helped Ramaphosa, because it has, in fact, he continues to have to fight on that front at the same time as leading the fight against the pandemic. So he is in a weak position. He doesn't have a united party behind him. He doesn't have you never have a united citizenry, do you? But you don't have a clear, even from the business sector, even though he is the business friendly president, there's no trust. And so I think the Zondo Commission has not really helped him.
When is it supposed to report? I don't know. I'm sorry.
It keeps getting extended. I think they are hoping that there will be a report. The last I heard, this process was going to end in March, but there'll be an extension, no doubt.
Yeah.
No doubt.
Yeah.
Just the extent of this, the sort of what's been revealed. I mean, for those who haven't been paying attention in the past couple of days to South African news, I mean, the most wild thing has emerged, namely the state security agency has been implicated in funneling money directly to Zuma, and to funneling money directly to a news agency.
Yeah, I think I saw the news agency part of it.
To pitch stories about Zuma that were positive. And we're talking like to Zuma money monthly, 4.5 million rand a month.
Yeah.
I mean, that's $450,000 a month from the state security agency to the president. Now, obviously, all this still needs to be verified, but I mean, that
was when he was president. It's not still going on.
No, that was when he was president. But I tell you, the ongoing effects. I mean, that's right. So that was pretty shocking. The ongoing problem has been the use of things like the public investment consortium, which is union money, right? Pensioners, money that people pay into their pensions.
CPPIB,
Yeah, just that money, because there are these strategic deployments into those funds, into managing those funds. All of that money going into propping up the news agencies, for example, that are sympathetic to the Zuma faction. So it is terribly scary. Yeah.
Okay. Linda Freeman has a question about how significant is Ace Magushule's refusal to step aside?
I think it's very significant, and I think it shows the sort of the limitations that of Ramaphosa's leadership. This is for everybody else's understanding.
The rest of us.
Magashule is the Secretary General of the ANC. It's a sort of second.
I'd heard of him being referred to in that position. Like I didn't know the name, but yeah.
Yeah. So he's been, he's a very powerful individual within the ANC. He's a former premier of the Free State, and has been widely accepted for ever to be a deeply corrupt individual, and has now been charged on the basis of some of his activities while he was premier. Despite the ANC Integrity Commission calling on Magashule to step down, he has refused to. And what is really striking is that the National Executive Committee, the NEC of the ANC, has not forced him to step aside while he tries to clear his name. And that just speaks to the limitations of power that Ramaphosa has and his faction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So sort of I mean, it really underlines something that I might have said at the last time we did this. It's not clear to me why the so-called good guys did not break away from the ANC in advance of the last election, because that was their moment. That was their moment to say, we're moving and we're taking the ANC with us. Or if you keep the name, but we're going to be something else. And that would have put us in a better position than we are now, where the country's more or less held hostage to these kinds of factional fights, and the presidency is hamstrung. Parliament, because of the COVID pandemic, hasn't really been meeting. And what is also coming out, by the way, in the Zondo Commission is how ineffective the parliamentary committees were in picking up on these irregularities in the last 10, 15 years. Right? So a lot of this, they should have been able to see. The Intelligence Committee should have seen the payments that were going to Zuma, or should have been able to pick up on this. The scale of it was so large that they should have seen it, but they didn't ask the right questions. They didn't investigate. So there are so many weaknesses in the system becoming evident.
So, I mean, we haven't had any new questions for a while. I mean, I guess basically as a concluding comments are your, what is the outlook? I mean, if the Zondo Commission drops its bomb on the table, does the bomb explode or does it go poof?
There's been a bomb a day, Bruce.
Well, I mean, that's the question. Yeah, I mean, it's basically, though, I mean, in the sense is that, in the absence of social disturbances and stuff like that, presumably nothing necessarily changes when you have a negative report. Is that what you're sort of suggesting?
Yeah, at this point, nothing much has changed. I guess, if I want to look at something optimistic going forward, if the agreements can be reached on the vaccine, if the particularly the agreements with India, it may actually turn out in the long run that we look back on this period and say, probably the very first vaccines that were developed are not appropriate for South Africa, given the conditions of storage and transportation and so on. The simpler one-shot vaccine may be a better option. So, maybe there's a delay, but the Johnson & Johnson vaccine proves to be effective enough. And then it's a one-shot thing, and the state will have the capabilities, I think, to do that. And then, that gives Ramaphosa a good news story, as it were, from which to then move forward. The sort of hopeful thing is that somehow the new team of economists who are trying to make an impact on the government will actually finally get heard. That the wild goose chase of saving the airlines and so on, that will all fall away. And then we just begin again, we kind of take this ruin that South Africa is at the moment and rebuild something. Personally, I'm very optimistic about that, because South Africa just has that ability to do it. We have the ability to rise phoenix-like from the most awful disasters. So I'm going to bank on that. Maybe a very false and very nationalistic way to end. But I think there's a tremendous capacity in South Africa for pulling things together at some point. And it may be that the pandemic will give us that opportunity.
Andre Barasa had a question, a follow-up, I guess, but I think, did COPE not try the same thing that you were talking about in 2008 and it broke away but failed? Is that when you were talking about Ramaphosa possibly breaking away, I guess he was...
Yeah, but they didn't do it they didn't do it effectively.
They didn't have the momentum.
Okay, actually we have another question too,
disaffected.
What chance did anyone who undertook to be Zuma's successor have of turning things around in short order, given what they were inheriting? Well, if they don't deal with the corruption, it's pretty clear, I guess. But one point I was going to make on the apropos of vaccines, the Chinese vaccine, I was talking to a friend in Wuhan, it's only from 18 to 60. They never tested it on old people, but I would have assumed that for the demographics in South Africa, that wouldn't be as big a deal as it might be in Canada, for example.
Yeah.
No, but coming to Shirley's question, and I'll just point out that's my mother, so I feel obliged to respond to my
Where
mother.
are you seeing these questions?
They're on the, if you go to the Q&A
on one side at the bottom, you can find.
Okay.
Yeah, as a dutiful son, I need to respond to my mother and say, I think what we're trying to say here, Mom, is that there wasn't the expectation that Ramaphosa was going to be able to turn things around in short order was misplaced. But what has been surprising has been the difficulty associated with it. We all assumed, I think, I can say this on your behalf, Shireen, we assumed that by putting in place things like the State Commission of Inquiry, by allowing the National Public Protector, or the Prosecuting Authority, NPA, to do its good work, trying to weed out corruption in the Hawks, which is the elite police force, that they were going to be able to make a difference. And what we're seeing is because of the extent of it, that it's going a lot slower and it's proving a lot harder.
Which I guess is sort of a concluding statement.
Yeah.
Well, maybe with luck, there'll be in 2 years, there'll be a little new upturn and you can come back and tell us about how things have got better. So thank you very much. We very much appreciate it. I think we've still got we had a big chunk of the people who registered actually show up and turn on their computers, and most of them are still there. So thanks very much. Just a reminder that we do have an event next week on the 5th on security, governance and security. And we will actually be having something on the Commonwealth Free Trade Agreement, Continental Free Trade Agreement on March 3rd, I believe. And so, but we'll be putting out notices for both of those things. So take care, have a good evening, and a good weekend when it gets here. Although these days, weekends, and they're all about the same. But anyway, there we are. All right, so take care, stay safe, and à la prochaine.
Merci beaucoup.
Thanks, David. Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you very much, both of you. Yes, that's great.
Yeah, thanks. That was great. Good fun. Always such a great engagement from the Africa Study Group. Really great.
Well, you're a very popular attraction, let me assure you. Take care.
And we didn't even really disagree, David, for once.
I know, barely, only around the edges.
Really?
All right. Good night, everyone.